I offer you a warm welcome to this first Japan Macro Salon for 2024, run jointly, as always, between the Japan Society of the UK and Asia Society Tokyo. I am Bill Emmett, and I have the honor of chairing the Japan Society. Thank you to all of you for your support for the Society and for this regular Japan Macro Salon. Joining me, as always, is our old friend Jesper Koll, longtime Japan resident and who has been chief economist and strategist for too many top investment houses to mention. He is a board director for Monex Group and the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology, and is two quite rare things: a non-Japanese member of Keizai Doyukai and a fully paid-up Japan Optimist. Our special guest today will be another old friend to the Japan Society, Keiko Iizuka, senior political writer for the Yomiuri Shimbun and lead commentator for the nightly news program Shinso News, News in Depth, on that firm's BS4 satellite channel. She's an incredibly experienced foreign correspondent who has had 2 postings in London, as well as 1 in Washington, D.C. We'll start with economics, and then after 10 or 15 minutes, we will move to politics and bring Iizuka-san onto the webinar. Please do submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and feel free at any time also to vote for others' questions to bring them more quickly to my attention. Now, Jesper, you recently published your annual list of what you call Japan surprises, the twists and turns that would change the global Japan narrative in the year of the dragon, as you put it. Now, I realize these are not forecasts, they're possible surprises, but one of them came close to a forecast. You started by saying that Japan's inflation and economic growth could outpace that of the United States this year. Is this because you're a pessimist about the US or see very optimistic omens in Japan?
Bill, thank you very much. I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's quite clear, that the tightening of monetary policy in the United States is now beginning to impact and slow down the US economy. And there's obviously a big debate. Is it a soft landing? Is it a hard landing? But I think, over the last couple of quarters, the US growing 3.5%, 4.5%, that period is over. And the US, in my personal opinion, is likely to have a soft landing. And whether that's 1.8% or 2.5%, I mean, be my guest. But the more important element is Japan. And I do think that the momentum in domestic demand, particularly, in the corporate side, is actually accelerating further. What do I mean by that? I do think that investment in physical capital, as well as in human capital, is going to be accelerating further throughout the next 12 to 18 months. And that as a result of that, domestic demand in Japan is actually going to be, quite strong. So that, I think, is, really the outlook, for 2024. Look at what I call the corporate metabolism, which is really the most exciting thing. And by that, I mean, number one, business investment spending. Number two, mergers and acquisition. Again, last year, a new record high. Also management buyouts, where you've got more and more companies actually going private because they don't want to deal, with all this shareholder activism that is actually happening. So I think that, you are looking at a Japan right now where corporate leaders are taking action. They're investing in the business. They're buying new equipment. Yes, they are also beginning to increase investment in human capital. And you may have seen that just over the last, 48 hours, the big business associations is beginning to lobby for 4% wage increases. So it's quite interesting, that you've got not the labor unions, of course, the labor unions, not the politicians, of course, the politicians, but you've got big business leaders lobbying, for higher wages. So that's quite exciting. And I think, again, as a result of that, the forecast for 2024 is that Japan's domestic economy is very likely to be one of the top performers in the G7.
Wow, well, that, as you say, that reflects weakness and strength, but that would be quite significant if it were to happen. And I note what you say about going private. I mean, Toshiba, of course, is the notable recent example, but also we can see the effect of the stock exchange corporate governance reforms that we've talked about on previous webinars, where there's a shape up or ship out kind of feeling as well, and we see both of the market indexes at record highs, the highs for 34 years, rather, not a record, but 34-year highs. What about wages? I'm interested in that because I've always been obsessed by domestic demand and the labor market, and that as the fundament for, if you like, domestic demand, the thing that ultimately drives some of that investment.
And
is that really going to outpace inflation this year? You had sort of real wage decreases for some of the last 2 years.
Yeah, and what is interesting, Bill, on that, there's Japan's, in terms of the aggregate wage numbers, the aggregate income numbers, there is a huge barbell in the sense of that the Mick Jagger generation, right, the baby boom generation, is still in this drawdown from, peak incomes going down towards pensions. And the pension income typically is about half of whatever it is that you earned before. So that drawdown is actually a very, very significant part for why aggregate wages, right, have not been growing very fast. But the interesting thing, Bill, is that at the front end of the generational curve, so for the people in their 20s and 30s, you actually do see very, very steady increases in wages. Now, in our world, you remember last year, Japan's richest man, Mr. Yanai from fast retailing, he announced that starting salaries at his company were going to go up by 40%. Now, this year, you had, for example, in the financial services industry, you had Nippon Life announcing that their starting salaries are going to be going up by 7%, which again is quite significant. You've got to remember that the Kishida administration is actually offering tax relief for companies who are increasing wages by more than 4%. So I think that, ironically, the reality of the super tight labor market, the war for talent accelerating, and, on top of that, all this tax incentive and the peer pressure beginning to come through, I do think that for the people in their 20s and 30s, you will see wage increases that could even be rising as far as double digit, for this year. And it's quite interesting when you look at the labor mobility, the number of people quitting companies to switch to other jobs in the same industry or another industry, that liquidity in the labor market here in Japan is accelerating very, very fast.
Wow. Well, if we really do see that coming through in, as you say, aggregate numbers, I mean, one always has those extreme examples like fast retailing and others, but and Suntory was another one, if I recall, last year. But if we can get it in aggregate numbers, then that gives a real basis for a growth in domestic demand. What about the effect of individual investment in the stock market? I mean, there's a lot of government-related praise for themselves for the if you like, NISAs, the savings accounts and so forth, bringing retail investors into the market. Is that really happening?
Look, the answer is that, when you look at account openings, right, they're accelerating at very, very rapid rates. Now, when you look at, where's the money actually being deployed, as you know, the new NISA, which now allows you, for up to 19 million, of your savings to be invested, tax-free, it's actually interesting. The bulk of the money flows actually goes to international. And as you know, I spend a fair bit of time, every other weekend, talking to Japanese retail investors. And it's very, very interesting because really what they want to know is, when should I buy Tesla? When should I buy the dip in Microsoft? And you can see it in the account number. So I personally, everything helps, and certainly, getting more stable domestic asset owners, into the stock market is going to be a positive force. But at the end of the day, the exciting part is the reality of corporate leaders in Japan now investing for growth in their companies, casting off some of the non-core businesses, and beginning to engage in more proactive mergers and acquisitions. And it's very interesting, Bill. There were a lot of people who were very skeptical and said, oh, with the yen so weak, we're going to see a decline in Japan's foreign direct investment. And of course, the reality is that exactly the opposite is happening. And of course, the big headline number in December, when you've got Nippon Steel buying US steel, for record valuation, it's very, very interesting. The currency, is not the deciding factor. The deciding factor is that Japanese CEOs have their mojo back. They want to build global platforms and are in fact increasing their global footprint. And you may have seen in one of my surprises for 2024, I fully expect that one of the Japanese mega banks is going to be buying a large American regional bank. So, the Bank of Texas or something like that. I think that, the mojo, when I talk to Japanese CEOs now of the sort of global 250, 300 companies here in Japan, they're not just looking, they're actually ready to pull the trigger.
Wow, yes. Well, that will be fascinating if that happens. Let's just, before we go on to politics, we better talk about the yen. Because clearly we have to talk about the yen, but also in a way, the implication of a soft landing in the US, faster growth in Japan, maybe therefore some more normalization of monetary policy. It ought to be a stronger yen. And a question has come in, will Bank of Japan interest rate hikes? That phrase hasn't been used for a long time. And a stronger yen hurt large Japanese exporters this year.
Right.
What extent does the yen undermine the positive outlook is the question.
So look, let's just be very, very clear. The sensitivity of Japan's listed companies' profitability to the exchange rates remains very large. Basically, for every 10 yen of yen depreciation, you're adding back about 7 percentage points, to Japanese listed companies' corporate profits. It's just the nature of the game. So of course, yen appreciation, would put that into reverse. Right. So that's one of the issues. The second issue is that for the currency, there is one element of Japan that is actually quite weak. And that is exports of machinery and machine tool companies. Now, we all know, right, that, last year, China, superseded Japan as the world's largest car exporter, yes. Right? Now, Toyota, basically produces about 11 million cars, and of these 11 million cars, basically, 8 million are produced overseas. So yes, Japan is not China in the sense that there is a lot of, overseas production capacity here. But the interesting thing is that clearly China is becoming more competitive, and you're seeing it in capital goods now as well. When you look at leading Japanese companies like Fanuc, the robotics company, when you look at Keyence, for example, when you look at Furukawa Electric, you actually find that their orders from the People's Republic of China and Asia Pacific are actually going down by 20, 30%. And, this is because the Chinese companies are now competitive. They're providing perfectly fine products, just as they provide a perfectly fine and working Shinkansen, right? So you do have substitution in capital goods in the machinery and machine tool sector towards Chinese companies away from Japanese companies. That's the one thing that I'm actually concerned about. I'm very happy about domestic demand. I'm very happy about, what corporations, what CEOs are doing in terms of investing for growth. But, the global competitiveness, people make the mistake of looking at the weakness in the headline GDP numbers in the People's Republic of China and saying, oh, China therefore is no longer a viable competitor. Quite the opposite. the excess capacity that China is accumulating, plus the reality that China now has perfectly fine engineering and machinery and machine tool companies, that actually having raised the bar of competitiveness for Japanese companies is something that one needs to watch out for. Now, what does that mean, Bill? I'm a big fan of buying or investing domestic demand related companies rather than globally sensitive companies. Number one, there is the risk of yen appreciation. There's the risk of dollar weakness that's going to be intensifying. But on top of that, you actually do have, for the Japanese exporters, you've got growing competitiveness from the People's Republic of China, which means, that their margins are going to be under pressure.
And we must remember that, as it were, an economic disaster for the People's Republic of China is 5% growth. So, so it's not zero, unfortunately, I'm afraid.
Bill,
Now let's go on.
Before we go on, this will be a nice dovetail into politics here, right? I mean, one final point, which is that, look, policy in Japan remains incredibly supportive. I mean, I literally fell flat on my face in Ministry of Finance, with a debt to GDP ratio of 260% plus, allows Prime Minister Kishida, to give an income tax cut. That's quite incredible, right? Yeah. And so I think from that perspective, and this goes to the Bank of Japan, this year we've got an easing of fiscal policy, and therefore I higher. And I fully do expect that by this time next year, the Bank of Japan policy rate is not going to be at 0, but is going to be at 0.5%.
We'll note that down, but that sounds plausible to me, actually. Now let's bring in Iizuka-san. Turn on your camera, Keiko Iizuka, if you could.
Yes.
And you should be brought into the center of the screen. There we are. Excellent.
Hello.
So welcome to the Japan Society, Iizuka-san. I've known Iizuka-san for a long time from both London and Tokyo, so delighted to have you here. We are delighted you have a day off from broadcasting on, otherwise you wouldn't be with us, so broadcast to us and our members. Now, politics. Jesper and I have been talking a lot about political decisions, the tax cut that made him fall on his face, the concessions for investors, the tax relief for wages. This obviously depends a lot on the duration of this government. The Kishida administration has not been looking strong lately. Of course, it goes way back to the Unification Church scandal, but then the political scandals, financing scandals surrounding the Abe faction that have led to a number of reshuffles. So what's your bet? There's a leadership election due in September. Will he last that long?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. What Kishida-san would like to hear and appeal to the Japanese public. So, but the problem is that not all the Japanese public do not see things as it is, maybe, or as you see. Or I think there should be more publicizing, for the merit of Japanese economy as of now. But first of all, in order to, I would like to characterize the current situation of Japanese politics as queer stability. Although there are many scandals and of financing party funds, but there are I think that there are very queer and strange stability within the LDP, and maybe in the public as well. I think that there are two reasons for that. The first is that young MPs, younger generation politicians, are not raising their voice for political reform as they did 30 years ago when recruit scandal and the Sagawa scandal took place. It's quite a different situation. Younger generation are not doing anything to appeal for reform, which is really queer for. I was a very beginner as a journalist at that time, but there was so much energy and the feeling of necessity to reform, but not now, not today. And the second reason is that there's no obvious movement of unseating Kishida within the LDP, which is quite strange. It's the cabinet approval rate is going down at the bottom, but it hit the bottom. I would like to point out after this, but there's not imminent move of unseating Kishida. In Japanese, it's called Kishida Oroshi, Mori Oroshi, Koizumi Oroshi. Oroshi is unseating. So there's no such kind of big, huge, imminent move within the LDP. It's really strange because, the LDP is facing a perhaps biggest crisis after the recruit scandal or, Sagawa scandal. That was some 30 years ago, 3 decades ago. But there's not imminent move of political crisis and something bursting from the crisis. So that's why I call this situation a queer stability.
How about, can I ask Iizuka-san, I mean, the other aspect of that kind of equilibrium in politics is the Komeito, the Komeito coalition, which to an outsider like me has always seemed so strange, but it's worked for a long time.
Right.
Does that also look in a state of queer stability? Even there are difficulties about defense export guidelines and so forth, but do you see that as also continuing?
Yes. Last year, the LDP and Komeito had some, difficulties regarding how to decide the candidates for the single constituencies. But I think they have made up. I think they made friends again. But as you say, regarding the defense export, the easing the rules for defense export, I think Komeito is really stiff. And the point is that Kishida-san is not that serious about persuading Komeito. What I mean is that within Kishida's mind, the priority is at this moment is maybe the relationship with Komeito, and secondary is the releasing or the easing of this defense export rule. So that's what makes some security experts in LDP are frustrated because they think that Kishida-san should be more serious about the security issues involving the release of the easing of defense export rules, and which is deeply related to the UK and Japan defense cooperation, as you know. So it's really serious. It's a serious it's a serious issue. But I think that, Kishida-san, I think as Jasper said, that in October, late October, he said that he copied the way of U.S. president style, that it's economy, economy, economy. So my priority is economy. So otherwise, he led the G7 summit. Japan was a chair country last year. So he led the Hiroshima G7 summit in May. And after that, he was not too enthusiastic about foreign policy, but he is more focused, according to his aides, he's more focused on economy and to raise the supporting rate of cabinet approval. And
Jesper, you were wanting to come in. Can I just interrupt? Jesper was waving his hand. I want to make sure.
No, I mean, look, I think, as you know very well, Bill, from previous discussion, I'm not a friend of Mr. Kishida and his policies. I think he's a very vicious manipulator. And I think that we are seeing actually under Mr. Kishida, we're seeing the second purge of the LDP. The first one was, to ruthlessly exploit the assassination of, Mr. Abe with the purge, surrounding the Unification Party. And now we've got the second purge, which in my personal opinion, and I worked as an aide to a member of parliament during the recruit scandal. This is not the recruit scandal. This is nothing. This is chump change. There's no money, in Japanese politics. But the reality is that the LDP has never been as boring, excuse me for being such a gaijin, there is just no debate. And everybody who is young and ambitious is basically just ducking down and trying to not ruffle any feathers. And the reason, in my personal opinion, for Prime Minister Kishida's, lack of popularity is that, again, the people are not stupid. You cannot, and this was Mr. Kishida's statement. Yes, I fell to the floor when he said, we're going to have a tax cut in 2024. But we also, he said in the same breath, he said, we're going to have a tax hike in 2025. Right. This is worse than Boris Johnson, to sort of have it and eat it at the same time. And so the reality is that in terms of the concrete policy incentives, whether it is on the corporate side or whether it's on the household side, it really is baramaki. It is trying desperately to buy popularity while actually everybody understands that you can't do it. Let me be very specific. So you have had, an increase in the child allowance, which sounds like a great thing since you're combating a declining birth rate, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, the detail of that policy does away with any means testing. So, even if you're in the highest tax bracket or if you have the highest asset number, that is possible, you're still going to get the full child allowance, which is actually regressive rather than progressive. And again, I think, in terms of, providing a sustainable economic framework, it's not happening.
I must, that's an excellent intervention. I must bring in a question that our old friend Tomohiko Taniguchi, former speechwriter for Minister Abe, has written in. Thank you very much, Taniguchi-san. He asks, how long will this queer stability last? Kishida will likely find no opportune time to dissolve the lower house, in which case there will be elections for both the lower and upper houses in 2025. As time proceeds, many rank-and-file LDP parliamentarians will voice their deepening concerns, wondering if they can campaign behind Kishida. What do you think, Iizuka-san?
Yes, Taniguchi-san was in the audience. I would like him to brief us. But, let me talk about the calendar, in order to see the future. Maybe just 1 year or 2 years from now. From the very recent one, It's January the 26th. That's next Friday. So that's when the diet session starts. And then there's going to be, in March, annual labor talks in spring. That's the wage will be talked about, as Jesper-san pointed out. And in April, or the 28th of April, there's going to be by-election, at least for Shimane, because of Hosoda san. Hosoda-san is a former speaker of the House Speaker, who is dead now. And some other by-elections will be held because of there should be some at least two members of parliament, both lower and upper, perhaps will be prosecuted because of this funding scandal. And so perhaps there might be some spaces. And so the point is that these by-elections will be perhaps seen as a de facto vote of confidence in the LDP or Kishida administration. That's going to take place at the end of April. And then unless Kishida-san dissolves parliament, which will be, I think that it's going to be difficult. And in June, fixed income and inhabitant tax reduction will be implemented. That's what Jesper pointed out. And I think that this March annual wage talks and in June's tax reduction, I think that's what Kishida counts most, that people feel that they get some money and appreciate Kishida. And so Kishida hopes that there should be an increase in popular support. And so if that works, maybe Kishida might try at the last minute dissolve of the lower house before September LDP presidential election. So that will be the only chance if Kishida would be able to go for snap election. But so I think that it's difficult.
So the election then, sorry, because then it would be in July, the election. Is that right?
Right.
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, okay. but that would be the only chance. And unless, and the reason why I think, many people know that the reason why Kishida would like to go for election is that he would like to win the presidential LDP presidential election unanimously. I mean, not uncontested. So, there's going to be an excuse for or justification for Kishida for not being challenged. So if he wins the election, that would mean that he might be able to win the second term as a LDP president uncontested. So but I think that chances are slim. But the reason why I characterize the current situation as queer stability is that, interestingly enough, the latest polls that came out just yesterday, show the cabinet approval rating has risen by 5 points by Kyodo and 3 points by NHK. So it's some kind of a trend of reboosting the Kishida administration's supporting rate reboosting. But this should be a temporary one, and it might be influenced by disastrous Noto earthquake on New Year's Day. The LDP is very strong in terms of disaster. So, and Japanese people remember well the chaos at the time of great earthquake in Tohoku in 2011. At
Mm.
that time, the DPJ was in power, and people don't want to repeat that. So, if disaster takes place, I think that the LDP support will naturally goes up a little bit, or at least stays, maintains the base. So, so I think, so my last point is that, if this goes on, there will be, I'm afraid that there's going to be apathy for politics and among the people, and also the distrust for Japanese legal system, because just today, this morning, Yomiuri reported, my paper reported this morning that the Tokyo prosecutor's Special Investigation Squad has decided not to prosecute 7 Abe faction leaders accused of violating the law to record party income in their political funding balance reports. So there was so much expectation that, and anger against or toward these MPs, but there's the squad decided that there's no collusion with treasurers of the faction. So they could not find the evidence of collusion. So that was such a disappointment among the people, especially in the world of social media. Lots of criticism toward prosecutors. So I think if this goes on, and the seriousness of this crisis is very deep, but there's not young MPs moving, and the legal system does not work. And so I think this year, Japan is not in a frustrating, Japan is surrounded by frustrating air. So that's the January situation in Japan.
Jesper, you wanted to come in, and then I'm going to go a bit international.
No, I think, and she made the important point. The reality is, this is, if you love Japanese politics, this is all terribly exciting. It's a little bit like watching the Kremlin under Yeltsin. But the reality is that the big winner, of all of this is, number one, the bureaucracy. Because politics is weak, which means that the bureaucrats basically rule, and that's particularly important, for foreign policy. In terms of domestic sense of crisis, there's disgruntlement, and there's disappointment, but the business leaders, are very busy doing their stuff. The government is not getting into their way in any meaningful way, and so from that perspective, giving money to younger politicians and trying to create a revolt within the LDP, certainly the Keidanren or the Keizai Doyukai is not thinking about this right now because they're busy doing their M&A and MBOs, right? So from that perspective, I think the irony, my personal opinion is, that it will be, right now we don't see it, that there will be a challenger from the LDP to Mr. Kishida in September. And I think that, Kishida is going to lose the September presidential election. Right now, how Japanese politics is. It's a little bit like a sumo match. You've got all this staring, all this ritual that sort of happens in between, but then the actual fight is actually a very, very quick one.
Now let's just, what is not a sumo match is the American primary system, although it does look like the giant Yokozuna, Mr. Trump, is prevailing in the Republican nomination. It's too early to really judge that, but nevertheless,
yeah. But I will just one thing I'd like to point out that if we go for presidential election in September in the LDP, there's another problem coming up. because for the if we take do a poll among the Japanese public, not within the LDP, but the Japanese public, the Ishiba-san, the Mr. Ishiba, former defense minister, it has the top priority. Last month, Nikkei did a poll, and the Ishiba had 21% of popularity. And the second is Shinjiro Koizumi, 19%. And next, Kono Taro Kono follows at 12%. And, Kishida-san has only 3%. 1,2,3,4,5,6at the seventh place. Follow Ishiba, Koizumi, Kono, Takaichi, Suga, Kamikawa, foreign minister, and then Kishida and Hayashi. It's pathetic. This is, and Ishiba, Koizumi, Kono is a regular, right? I mean, they are popular among the public, but very, very unpopular within the LDP. And they don't have any factions to support them. And so if you go for election in September, I think that Kishida, as you say, Kishida will win because there's no possible alternatives for Kishida.
I think he will lose. I think he will lose, and I think
sorry.
You're going to see you're going to see the great Mr. Aso Taro making a third comeback.
Oh my God!
Okay, sorry. My bad.
Shooting
I think that it's so that's more pathetic, isn't it? I mean, Ishiba, Koizumi, Kono, there's no possibility. In my opinion, in my view, Kono Taro, I don't think that Aso will approve that. And Shinjiro Koizumi, he's not that popular in the LDP. And Ishiba, he is hated, I mean, by all the, maybe the most of the leaders. Do you know that this, today, there was a second political renewal headquarter meeting today, second time, and which Kishida is chairing. And he is saying that, by next Friday, they are going to finalize the interim report of political reform. But the member was appointed by Kishida and his aide, and Ishiba was not selected as a member. Member is 38 people. And then Ishida was the leader. Ishiba is considered as a leader of political reform, even 30 years ago, and now as well. So that shows everything. I mean, Ishiba is hated by Aso, and Ishiba is hated by Motegi, and Ishiba, because Aso hates Ishiba, I don't think that Kishida will pick him as his successor. So meaning that the three of them, Ishiba, Koizumi, Kono, three of them are not, they will not have a big support within the LDP, which would mean that Kishida will win. Very, very unfortunate situation.
So that's an excellent picture of this this soap opera, this comic opera, this sumo match that we've been described. Now we've got just over 10 minutes to go, so we need to focus a bit on that's first of all the Japanese position in international affairs. William Horsley has asked, where is Japan when the US and UK leaders are talking about the crises in the Middle East, Ukraine, and parts of the global South are talking about the world being in a pre-World War III phase? Well, of course, Mrs. Kamikawa was in Ukraine the last few days, so there is some Japanese involvement, but at the same time, perhaps the other background we should say is about the American presidential election. Maybe both of you, perhaps first Jesper and then Iizuka-san, what sort of shadow does the US election pose over Japanese politics, but also Japan's position in international affairs and the economy, when you've got Trump leading in the polls and wanting to put a 10% tariff on all imports? Is this a serious shadow, or will Mr. Kishida or his successor jump on a plane to Washington, to New York, the day after or Marral or Florida the day after the election and do an Abe?
Yep. No, but this is you again you're slip sliding, right, into a situation where effectively politics is navel gorging, and trying to play these little palace intrigues, but policy is on autopilot and is being done by the bureaucrats.
Right.
And if you do indeed get a radical swing, in the United States, with Mr. Trump coming back in and saying all sorts of things and wanting to do all sorts of things, I think that you will find that Japan is just going to be turning very, very quiet. You will not get, sort of a revival. There needs to be a crisis, in international relations, a crisis, that forces, and that, in my personal opinion, that's exactly what's likely to happen, that you do have, Mr. Trump coming in, and he would propose all sorts of radical things, whether it's in, with the tariff being imposed, whether it's, the usual stuff about, withdrawing the troops and all of that wonderful stuff. It's going to be quite radical, but Japan won't be able to respond because, remember, Prime Minister Abe, during that time, there was still a very acute sense of crisis here in Japan. And that sense of crisis, had a very tight-knit leadership team around Prime Minister Abe, and they rolled up their sleeves and got going to deal with this. Now, this is not going to be happening. It's more of an ostrich in the sand, type of political reaction that's likely to be following.
And Iizuka-san, in terms of the defense buildup, which is obviously a major both security policy, a regional foreign policy decision, and of course an economic decision in terms of the defense industry, do you see that now as being on what Jesper calls autopilot, that at least for the 5-year period to 2027, beyond, it's a fixture in Japanese politics, regardless of all of these personalities we've been talking about, regardless of what happens in the White House and so forth? Is that just a central assumption that we should make, that this carries on, or is it always under debate?
Very, very important question. I think that, Japan, regardless of how the U.S. politics turns, Japan will and should go in line with the defense plan that that's decided about 1 year ago. And that was a very major decision and the turning of Japan's defense policy. So I think that Japan has now a strength and conviction that Japan itself should build appropriate defense security measure, including acquiring necessary military equipment as well, and the military policy as well. And I would just point out that how to cope, how to prepare for Trump version 2, that might start in January 2025. And as I watch this Iowa caucus today, and Trump already acts like he got the nomination already today. And so I think that if he wins Super Tuesday in March, perhaps he would or he would perhaps soon start disseminating his promises, maybe to decrease the support for Ukraine, or maybe do an summit meeting with Putin and decide, the partition of Ukraine and so forth. and maybe U.S. might become or go out of NATO. That kind of all the promises might come out after March, Super Tuesday, when Trump's nomination would be make possible. So my point is that Japan should prepare before prepare for the second Trump administration, no matter no matter what the result of the election is. I think Japan should prepare itself, and along with other allies like Australia or South Korea and EU members, and including the UK, without US involving. I mean, we should strengthen the network of allies, US allies. That's my point.
I think you're certainly right that this sort of negative possibility strengthens the case for a more independent Japanese foreign policy and defense policy. I'm sure that's right. Jesper, and I'm going to bring in Nippon Steel in a second.
Yep, no, just two very quick points here. First of all, the reality is that the bureaucrats are working overtime, actually together with business right now, on defense spending, because the whole question is fine. The decision has been made; it will be doubled. But are we only going to consume, i.e., buying kit from the United States and others? Or are we actually going to redesign our innovation complex so that actually there is a chance through dual use technology that the increase in defense spending actually is going to lead some positive multipliers? And that requires a lot of changes, both in academia as well as in the way, the appropriations are being done. So there's a lot of detailed work and communication with the business leaders that is actually going on here. The second point I want to make is that as far as the populace is concerned, the decision has been made, but you haven't decided how to pay for it. Right. And so what will happen is that, and this is where Kishida, in my opinion, is running a very, very bad economic policy, because you've got tax cuts this year, you've got these unfunded increases in the budget. And so what that means is that come 2025, you will have to increase taxes. Yeah. That's the only choice that's going to happen. And as a result of that, you're setting yourself up for a massive reorganization of the LDP. And I think that this is where it's going to get very, very interesting. Right now, what you call this queer equilibrium, or, there's this unholy silence there. But, the storm will be unleashed when you actually do have to campaign on the idea, yes, we're going to increase taxes.
Yes.
And there's going to be a part in the LDP that says, no, we won't. We're going to have to issue more bonds, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I think in terms of thinking in terms of economic policy, right? That's where right now you are in a very, very fake environment, right? Because you're doing these tax cuts, you're promising increase, you're committing to increases, in structural expenditure growth, right? And it's unfunded. So this is where it's going to get very interesting in 2025, not 2024.
Well, that we'll look forward to surprises 2025 from you. But just finally, we've got a couple of minutes left. I mean, M&A investment. There was that dramatic proposal to buy U.S. steel by Nippon Steel. As you said, Japanese corporate bosses have their mojo investing abroad. Are you seeing also an increase in interest in investing in Japan? I mean, by foreign companies. I mean, my eye always sees Taiwanese companies, of course, in the semiconductor business. But let's just talk for 2 minutes about that.
No, and look, I mean, the empirical evidence is just there, and it's not just semiconductors. In fact, this morning I gave a presentation to the board, the global board of one of the world's largest hospitality companies. And for the first time ever, they have their global board meeting here in Japan, and they are committing to significant increases, right, in acquisitions and investments here in Japan. And you find it, across the board. When you look at the industrial companies, when you look at software companies, even gaming companies, Japan is cheap. Japan offers value. It's got the rule of law. I was in New York recently. I had to give a presentation. And so I asked, well, what do you want me to talk about? And they just said, well, you just need one slide, not China.
Japan is not China. Right. Okay. Well, that's a wonderful theme to finish this webinar on. I want to say thank you to all members of the Not China Society, the Japan Society, and to the Asia Society of Tokyo for attending this event. I want to thank Keiko Iizuka and Jesper Koll for giving us such a great illumination and entertainment about the intricacies of both the economy and politics. And I look forward to, of course, seeing you all back again in 3 months' time for the next Japan Macro Salon, but also other Japan Society events. Meanwhile, I wish you all a very good evening or a very good afternoon. Thank you, Jesper. Thank you, Keiko. See you soon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.